She didn't cry when her sisters took the cattle. She didn't cry when they took the horses. The deed, the winter grain, and every dollar their mother had kept in the tin box beneath the kitchen floor. She didn't cry when they handed her a lantern pointed at the collapsed north barn and told her that was all that was left. Clara Whitmore cried for the first time that night when her 6-year-old daughter tugged her sleeve and whispered, "Mama, is it warm enough in there for my baby brother?" And Clara had no answer. Before we go any further, if this story already has your heart, please subscribe to our channel and hit that bell so you never miss a single part. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Montana and to the woman nobody expected to survive the winter. The morning they buried Eleanor Whitmore, the ground was already hard. Clara felt it through the soles of her boots, that particular coldness that meant Montana was done negotiating with summer. The sky above the cemetery sat low and gray as old dishwater, and the wind coming off the northern ridge had teeth in it. She stood at the edge of the grave with baby James pressed against her chest beneath her coat. One arm wrapped around him so tight she could feel his heartbeat against her ribs. Beside her, Nora, 6 years old. Dark-haired, serious, in the way that children become serious when they've watched too many adult faces, trying not to fall apart, stood with both hands clenched in the fabric of Clara's coat. Neither of them spoke. Clara watched the pine box disappear beneath the first shovels of dirt and felt something inside her go very quiet. Not numb. Quiet. The way a room goes quiet right before something breaks. Her 2 older sisters stood across the grave. Ruth was 41, broad-shouldered, with their mother's same gray eyes, except colder. She had her husband Franklin beside her, and Franklin had his lawyer beside him, and the lawyer had a leather satchel across his chest, and that satchel told Clara everything she needed to know about what was coming next. Margaret was 37. She'd always been the pretty one, the one their mother bragged about in town, the one who married well and moved to Billings and came back twice a year at Christmas with store-bought gifts and opinions about how the ranch was being run. She stood with her arms folded and her eyes scanning the property line like she was already measuring something. Neither of them looked at Clara during the service. Reverend Holt read from Psalms. Clara didn't hear a word of it. She was watching Ruth's hand rest on the leather satchel. When the last prayer ended and people began moving toward the road, Ruth walked around the grave without hesitation. Franklin came with her. The lawyer stayed 2 steps behind. "Clara," Ruth said. Not a greeting, a preface. "Let her at least get off the cemetery ground first," said Margaret, following. "Have some decency, Ruth. I have plenty of decency. I also have a schedule." Ruth stopped directly in front of Clara and looked at her the way a buyer looks at livestock, assessing, already calculating the discount. "Franklin's had the ranch appraised. The deed goes into probate tomorrow morning." Clara shifted baby James against her chest. "Mama's been in the ground 10 minutes, Ruth. Mama's been sick for 8 months. This isn't a surprise to anyone." Ruth reached out and took the leather satchel from the lawyer, unclasped it, and produced a folded document. She left no formal will, which means the estate divides by Montana law, and Montana law gives the primary share to the 2 eldest surviving children. That's Margaret and me. "And me," Clara said. "You received the north parcel." Ruth said it like a fact, flat as a fence post. 20 acres above the old creek bed. The collapsed barn. The well. The well's been dry for 15 years. Then you'll need to dig. Clara looked at her sister for a long moment. James made a small sound against her chest, and she rocked him without thinking. "Where am I supposed to live, Ruth? Where are my children supposed to sleep?" "The barn has 4 walls. The barn has 4 walls and a roof with 3 holes in it." "Then you'll patch them." Ruth folded the document, put it back in the satchel, and handed the whole thing back to the lawyer. "The cattle are being moved to Franklin's property by Friday. Horses, too. Margaret is taking the household goods we already agreed on the split. The grain in the south silo and the winter stores are accounted for. Mama's furniture, her linens, her... accounted for," Margaret said. The word was soft, almost apologetic, but she didn't change her answer. Clara looked at her older sister and saw something she hadn't expected, a flash of something that might have been guilt, quickly covered. "Maggie," she said quietly, "you know this isn't right." Margaret looked away. "It is what it is," Ruth said. She buttoned her coat. "You always knew you'd get the least, Clara. You didn't work the ranch. You weren't here. You married that Whitmore man and went south and came back with 2 children and no husband and no money, and Mama took you in out of kindness." She paused. "That kindness died with her." Clara felt Nora's grip tighten on her coat. She looked down at her daughter. Nora was staring up at Ruth with an expression that was too old for her face, measuring, memorizing the way children do when they are storing something they will carry for years. "Don't," Clara said quietly to no one in particular. "Don't what?" Ruth asked. "Don't do this in front of my daughter." Ruth glanced at Nora with about as much warmth as she gave the frozen ground. "She'll need to learn how the world works eventually. She's 6. I was 6 when Papa made me muck 3 stalls every morning before school. She'll be fine." Ruth adjusted her gloves. "Franklin will have a man come out tomorrow to collect the horses. Have them in the south paddock by 8 o'clock." And she walked away. Franklin nodded once at Clara. Not apologetic, not unkind, just businesslike, and followed his wife toward the road. Margaret lingered. "Maggie, don't." Margaret's voice dropped. She didn't look up. "I can't go against Ruth. You know I can't. Franklin holds the notes on her husband's land in Billings, and if she crosses Ruth, then Franklin—" She stopped herself, smoothed her skirt. "It's just how it is. It's not how it has to be. Maybe not." Margaret finally looked at her, and the guilt was all the way on the surface now, naked and ugly, and something she clearly wished Clara couldn't see. "There's a small provision. Mama left you the contents of the north barn. Whatever's in there. We agreed to let you have that. The barn is collapsed. There might still be something worth salvaging." She reached into her pocket and pressed something into Clara's free hand, folded bills. "Not many. For the children. Don't tell Ruth." Then she walked away too. Clara stood at the edge of her mother's grave with her baby against her chest and her daughter's hand in hers, and Margaret's folded bills in her fist, and the wind hitting her from 3 directions at once. "Mama," Nora said. "Yeah, baby." "Are we going to live in the barn?" Clara breathed. "For a while." "Is the barn warm?" And that was the question that made her cry. She stood there until the gravedigger finished his work and looked at her sideways, clearly wanting her to leave. She stood there until Nora stopped asking questions and simply leaned against her side, understanding in the way children understand that silence sometimes means the adult is holding something too heavy to talk through yet. Then she walked her daughter to the wagon, settled baby James into the quilted box she'd rigged in the back, helped Nora climb up, and drove them north. The north parcel was 3 miles from the main ranch house up a rutted track that climbed away from the creek, and then leveled across a broad frozen flat before dropping toward the tree line. Clara had been there exactly twice in her life, once as a girl, when she'd followed her mother up the track out of curiosity, and been told to go back home, and once 2 years ago when she'd brought Nora up to see the old property, and found the barn listing badly to the east, with one wall half collapsed, and the door hanging off its hinges. It looked worse now. She stopped the wagon at the edge of the property and sat for a moment looking at it. 4 walls. Ruth had said that, and technically she was right. All 4 walls were standing. The roof had caved on the north side, and the door was gone entirely, and the corral fence had blown down at some point, and lay in a tangle of rotted timber and rusted wire, but 4 walls. "Is that it?" Nora asked. "That's it." Nora studied it with great seriousness. "It's big. It is big," Clara agreed. "Bigger than the room me and baby James had at Grandma's house. A lot bigger." Nora nodded, apparently deciding this was sufficient. "Okay." Clara could have kissed her for that. She drove the wagon up to the barn door, the gap where the door had been, and spent the next hour pulling the wagon inside out of the wind. She made a bed for the children in the wagon bed itself, piling everything she'd brought, 3 quilts. 2 blankets, a canvas tarp into a nest that would hold body heat. She fed James, who was hungry and furious about it in the wordless, relentless way of very young babies, until he calmed and slept. She let Nora eat the last of the cornbread she'd wrapped in cloth that morning, and drink water from the canteen. Then she sat on the barn floor in the gray afternoon light and took stock. She had the wagon and the draft horse to pull at Bess, 16 years old and slow but steady. The only animal her sisters hadn't bothered to claim because she was too old to be worth selling. She had the quilts and blankets and tarp. She had a cast-iron skillet, a small axe, a box of matches, half a bag of cornmeal, some dried beans, 4 cans of tomatoes, a jar of salt, and Margaret's folded money, $12. She had no food for Bess. She had no stove. She had no water that she could see. She had no glass in any of the windows, which were just open holes in the wall. She had no way to seal the gap where the door had been. What she had was a baby, a 6-year-old, and the certainty that if she sat here cataloging what she didn't have, she would freeze before she made it to morning. So she got up. She blocked the door gap with the wagon itself, pulled it perpendicular, so the wagon's side wall became a rough door. She nailed the tarp across the worst of the roof gap, using nails she found in a rusted tin on a shelf and a rock as a hammer. She gathered every loose piece of timber she could find in and around the barn, and built a fire in the center of the dirt floor, digging a rough pit first to contain it, venting through the hole in the roof. By the time full dark fell, the barn was not warm exactly, but survivable. She sat beside the fire with James asleep in her lap, and Nora curled against her side and listened to the wind work at the walls. And then she felt it. Warm air, coming up through the floor. She almost dismissed it, thought it was the fire's heat settling, reflecting back some trick of the dirt and the old timber. But Nora had fallen asleep and James was still, and she sat very still herself, and after a minute she felt it again. Not from the fire's direction, from behind her near the back wall. A slow, steady seep of warmth coming up through the floorboards. She laid James carefully beside Nora on the quilt and stood. The back third of the barn had tongue-and-groove planking laid over the dirt. She'd assumed it was just an old feed floor, something to keep grain dry. She crossed to it and crouched and put her hand flat against the boards. Warm. Not from the fire. The fire was 20 feet away. This warmth was coming from below. She pressed her ear against the floor and listened. Nothing. No sound. Just warmth. She ran her hands along the boards and found them tight, well-fitted, but in the far corner where the boards met the wall, she found a spot where the fit was slightly different. A seam that didn't match the others. She pressed it and felt the boards shift almost imperceptibly, like something fitted and deliberate rather than settled and old. She sat back on her heels. Her mother had told her to go home that one time she'd followed her up the track as a girl. "Go home," Eleanor Whitmore had said. "This isn't for you yet. Yet." Clara put her hand flat against the seam in the floor and held it there. From somewhere outside, Bess shifted her weight and blew out a breath, and the barn creaked in the wind. "Not yet," Clara said quietly, to nobody, to herself, to the warmth coming up through the boards. "But soon." She went back to her children and pulled them close against her sides and lay down on the barn floor beside the fading fire. She didn't sleep for a long time. She lay there listening to James breathe and Nora breathe and the wind batter the walls and the warmth seeping up from the floor beneath her, slow and steady, like something patient. Like something waiting for her. She woke before dawn to the sound of a horse. Not Bess, a different horse, heavier-footed, approaching from the north track. Clara was on her feet before she was fully awake. Instinct moving her body, while her mind caught up, and she had the axe in her hand by the time she reached the gap by the wagon. The rider stopped 10 feet out. He was a big man. She registered that first, then registered the way he sat, the horse easy and unhurried, one hand loose on the reins. He wore a dark coat and a hat with the brim pulled low, and he made no move toward the barn, just sat there. "I don't mean to alarm you, ma'am," he said. His voice was low, careful. "Name's Cole Turner. I run cattle through the North Pass. I was coming down the track at first light and saw smoke. So nobody's lived on this parcel in years." A pause. Wanted to make sure the smoke wasn't the barn burning. It's a fire I built. Yes, ma'am. I can see that now. He didn't move. You all right? I'm fine. You're standing in a collapsed barn in November holding a hatchet. I said I'm fine. Another pause. He tilted his head slightly. Is that a baby I hear? James had woken at the sound of voices and was making his displeasure known from inside the wagon. Clara's jaw tightened. That's my son. How old? 4 months. Cole Turner looked at her for a moment, not up and down, not the way men sometimes looked, but direct the way someone looks at a problem they're trying to understand honestly. You got food. Enough. You got water. She didn't answer. The creek's a 1/4 mile east, he said. Cuts close to the tree line before it bends south. It'll run clear under the ice if you break through. He reached into his saddlebag and produced something wrapped in cloth. I've got hardtack and dried venison, more than I need. I'm not taking charity from a stranger. It's not charity, it's a trade. He held the cloth package toward her. You let me water my horse at your well, and we're square. My well's dry. Then it's just breakfast. He leaned down and set the package on the ground between them and straightened back up. I'll be coming back through on my way north in a few days. I can bring grain for your horse if you need it. Why? He thought about that. Because it's cold, he said finally. And because whatever happened to put a woman and 2 children in a broken barn overnight, I reckon it wasn't her idea. Clara looked at the package on the ground. Then she looked at him. His eyes were dark and steady and held nothing she could read as a threat. I don't know you, she said. No, ma'am, but I know this land pretty well, and I know that the old spring that feeds the north pasture runs warm year-round. Whatever you're feeling come up through that floor, that's her. He gathered his reins. I'll come back through in 3 days. If you don't need anything, just don't come to the door. He turned the horse and rode back up the north track without looking back. Clara stood at the gap in the barn wall and watched him go. Then she picked up the cloth package. Hardtack and dried venison just as he'd said. And beneath the venison, wrapped in a second cloth, a small bag of oats. Enough for Bess for 2 days. She stood there holding it and felt something she hadn't felt in long enough that she almost didn't recognize it. Not gratitude exactly. Something quieter than gratitude and more complicated. She went inside and fed her horse, and then fed herself, and then fed Nora, who woke up and ate without asking any questions, because at 6 years old, she had already learned that her mother sometimes needed things to be simple. And when the children were settled and the morning had come properly over the frozen flats, Clara went back to the corner of the barn where the seam was in the floor. She put both hands on it. She pressed. The boards shifted, and beneath them, the faintest smell of warm stone and old paper and something her mind tried to name and couldn't. Something that reached into her chest and pulled at something she'd thought was grief, but suddenly wasn't sure. Mama, she said. The warmth rose up around her hands. She pressed down harder and felt the seam give just a fraction, just enough to understand that it was meant to open, that it had always been meant to open, that someone had built this to be found by someone willing to press hard enough. Outside, Nora called her name. Coming, Clara said. She let her hands rest flat against the wood one moment longer. The warmth moved through her palms and up her arms, and she thought about her mother standing in the cemetery, not the day they buried her, but years before that, the day Clara had followed her up the north track as a girl. Go home. This isn't for you yet. She was home. And it was time. She didn't open it that morning. Nora needed her, and James needed her, and Bess needed water, and the fire had burned down to nothing, and the temperature inside the barn had dropped enough that her breath came out in small white clouds. Clara made herself move through each task with her hands, while her mind stayed back in that corner, pressed against the warmth coming up through the boards, turning over the question she didn't have an answer for yet. Her mother had built something under that floor. The certainty of it settled into her chest like a stone. Not heavy exactly, but solid. Undeniable. Eleanor Whitmore had sent her youngest daughter to a cold, broken barn in November with nothing, and called it an inheritance. Ruth had laughed about it. Margaret had looked away, but their mother had never done anything without a reason. Clara had spent 29 years watching Eleanor Whitmore do exactly what people underestimated her for doing, moving quietly, working slowly, letting other people believe she was small while she built things they never thought to look for. Clara had learned that from her. It was the one thing her sisters hadn't been able to take because it lived inside her skin rather than on a deed. She broke ice on the creek and hauled water back for Bess, and boiled the rest over a rebuilt fire, and fed Nora and James, and sat with the morning moving around her. Then she went to the corner. She pressed both palms flat against the seam and pushed. And this time she put her weight into it, and the boards swung inward, not up inward, hinged from below, counterweighted somehow, so that the whole section moved as one piece. A smell rose up to meet her warm, stone-dry earth candle wax, and something she couldn't name, except that it made her think of her mother's hands. She found the iron-rung ladder bolted to the stone wall and went down. She stood at the bottom and didn't move for a full minute. "Mama," she said again. And her voice came back to her from warm stone walls, and this time it didn't sound like grief at all. The shelter was large, larger than she could have imagined from the size of the barn floor above. Stone walls fitted tight without mortar, the kind of patient, careful work that takes years of Sundays. A natural spring entered through a crack in the east wall, pooled in a channel her mother had lined with flat rock, and drained out through a pipe she couldn't see the end of. The water was warm, not hot, but the kind of warmth that meant it came from deep in the earth, the kind that didn't freeze even in Montana January. Shelving along 3 walls, floor to ceiling, loaded with things that took Clara several minutes to fully take in. Preserved food jars and tins enough to last a hard winter, maybe 2. Blankets folded in oilcloth. Medicine bottles labeled in her mother's handwriting. Candles dozens. Children's clothes in several sizes, small dresses. Boys' shirts. Soft leather shoes. All of it clean. All of it folded, arranged with the kind of care that meant someone had touched each piece deliberately. Tools. A small medical kit with proper instruments. Quilts thicker than anything Clara had seen in the main ranch house. And in the far corner, stacked in a cedar box with a simple latch bundles of letters. She crossed to the box and opened it. The first bundle was tied with kitchen twine and labeled in her mother's hand, "Received." The second, "To send." The third had no label, just a red ribbon, and when Clara untied it and unfolded the top letter, she read the first line and stopped breathing. "If you are reading this, then you have come here because you had nowhere else to go. You are safe. The door above you is heavy enough to hold against a man twice your size. The spring runs year-round. There is food enough for 6 people for 2 months. You do not need to explain yourself to anyone. Rest first. Then we will figure out the rest together." It was her mother's handwriting. Clara sat down on the stone floor and read it again. She went through every letter in the unlabeled bundle before she heard Nora calling down through the barn floor, and she climbed back up and stood in the cold barn with her hands full of paper and her mind rearranging everything she thought she knew about Eleanor Whitmore. Her mother had been running a refuge, not a rumor, not a small quiet kindness, a system organized, stocked, maintained. Letters went out to women in neighboring counties, to churches, to a doctor in Billings, whose name Clara recognized from town, to a woman in Helena who ran a boarding house. The letters that came back were from women with no last names, given sometimes just initials asking questions her mother answered in the copies she'd kept. "How long can we stay? Is it safe in winter? My husband will come looking. My children are young. I have nowhere." And her mother's answers, patient and exact. "Come before nightfall. The barn door faces east. Lift the 3rd board from the left in the back corner. The latch opens inward. You are safe." She was still standing there holding the letters when she heard the horse. Heavy-footed. From the north track, Cole Turner came through the gap in the barn wall leading his horse by the reins, a grain sack over one shoulder and something else in his other hand, a cast-iron pipe coupling, she realized. For a stove. He stopped when he saw her face. "What happened?" he said. "Nothing." She folded the letters against her chest without thinking. He looked at her hands. "That doesn't look like nothing, ma'am." I found something under the floor. He set the grain sack down. He set the pipe coupling down. He didn't move closer, just looked at her with that same direct steadiness from the morning before. You want to tell me about it? I don't know you well enough. No, he said. You don't. He pushed his hat back on his head and crouched down to look at the barn floor, the open seam in the far corner, the darkness below it. He was quiet for a moment. How long's it been there? I don't know. Years. My mother built it. Eleanor Whitmore. It wasn't a question. Clara's eyes went sharp. You knew her. Cole looked up at her and seemed to weigh something behind his eyes. I transported cattle through this pass for 6 years, he said carefully. Your mother flagged me down twice. Both times she had a woman and children in a wagon who needed to get somewhere quiet. I drove them north, no questions asked. He paused. She paid me in food, good food too. Better than I deserved for 2 days' work. The silence between them had weight. You never told anyone, Clara said. She asked me not to. And you just agreed. A woman you barely knew asked you to transport strangers through the mountains, and you just did it. Cole looked at her steadily. She didn't tell me why the first time. She just said there were people who needed help getting somewhere, and could I be trusted? And I said yes, because my mother raised me to say yes to that question. He picked up the grain sack and held it out to her. I brought the grain I said I would. And the coupling because that roof hole wants a proper pipe through it before real cold sets in, or you'll lose your fire draw. Clara took the grain sack. She looked at him for a long moment. You can water your horse at the spring, she said. Inside, below. Something shifted in his face, not surprise, more like recognition, as if something he'd suspected had just been confirmed. All right, he said quietly. She showed him the hidden hatch, and he went down the ladder and stood at the bottom for a long time without speaking, turning slowly, looking at the shelving and the spring and the cedar box. His horse waited patiently above. Lord, he said finally. His voice was low. She spent 10 years on it, Clara said from the ladder above him. The letters go back that far, women from all across the county, some from further. And your sisters don't know it's here. They don't know this barn has a floor worth looking at. Ruth gave me the north parcel because she thought she was punishing me. Clara paused. My mother gave her the chance. Cole looked up at her. You understand what you're holding here? I'm beginning to. There are men in this county who would not want this to be found. His voice went careful in the way that meant what he was saying was more serious than the tone suggested. Men who profited off women having no safe place to go. Men who own the bank and the county records office, and who have spent considerable time and money making sure the law moved slow when it came to certain families. He came back up the ladder and stood in the barn with her. Your mother knew that. That's why she built it underground. Clara thought about the letters. The women with no last names, the initials. The careful instructions for arriving before nightfall. Who? She said. Cole was quiet for a moment. There's a man named Aldous Greer. He runs the Territorial Bank out of Hardin. He also sits on the County Deed Commission. He paused. 4 women in the last 3 years lost their land to his bank after their husbands died or left. Properties that should have been theirs under law. Greer found paperwork reasons to foreclose early debt claims, contested deeds, liens nobody remembered agreeing to. Another pause. There's also Reverend Caleb Marsh, who runs the congregation in town, and who has a habit of advising grieving women that signing over property management to the church is the godly thing to do. My mother documented them, Clara said. In the letters, names, dates, amounts. Cole went very still. Every one, she said. She kept copies of everything. Land transfers, debt records, names of women who came through here, and why they ran. She pressed her hand against the cedar box she still held. It's all here. The quiet between them was different now. Not the silence of 2 strangers being careful around each other, but the silence of people who have just understood something at the same moment and are each waiting for the other to say it first. If Greer finds out this place exists, Cole said slowly, he'll take the land before spring, Clara finished. Legal reasons or not. He won't need legal reasons. He makes the legal reasons. Cole looked at her. Does anyone in town know you're out here? Ruth told half the county I was living in a broken barn. She thought it was funny. Then they know the location. Yes, and they'll assume it's empty by January. He pulled his hat off and ran a hand through his hair, and she saw the furrow between his brows deepen. Clara. He said her name for the first time, and she noticed it the way you notice a door opening into a room you've walked past 100 times. You cannot stay here alone. I don't see that I have much choice. You have more choice than you think. He put his hat back on. I run cattle north until the end of the month. After that, I'm wintering here in the valley. I can work. He held her gaze. I'm not asking for anything. I just mean that a woman alone on an unmarked parcel with evidence that could destroy two of the most powerful men in the county is not safe, and I would sleep better if I wasn't the only person who knew about it. You've known about it for about 40 minutes, and I already can't stop thinking about what happens when Greer sends someone up this track. Nora appeared from behind the wagon, having clearly been listening for at least the last several exchanges, and looked up at Cole Turner with the measuring expression she'd been wearing since the cemetery. Are you the man who left the food? She asked. I am, Cole said. The oats were good. Bess liked them. She considered him with her head tilted. Do you know how to fix roofs? I know something about it. Our roof has holes in it. I noticed that. Nora looked at her mother. I think he should fix the roof, she said with the calm finality of a 6-year-old who has decided that a matter is settled. Clara looked at her daughter. Then she looked at Cole Turner, who was watching Nora with an expression that had gone slightly soft around the edges in a way she didn't think he was aware of. You fix the roof, Clara said. We call it fair trade. That's a good deal for me, he said. Roofing's easier than owing. He went back to his horse and began unloading what he'd brought, and Clara carried baby James down from the wagon and stood just inside the barn entrance and watched Cole Turner move and thought about her mother sending women north up this very track in the dark quietly year after year, while the county assumed Eleanor Whitmore was just a small woman who kept a modest ranch and minded her own business. She thought about Ruth dividing the cattle and Margaret looking away, and the lawyer with his leather satchel. She thought about Aldous Greer and the deed commission and 4 women in 3 years who'd lost what was theirs. Then Nora tugged her sleeve. Mama, she said, there's a wagon on the track. Clara looked up. Coming down the north road, moving slow through the frozen ruts, was a wagon she didn't recognize. It stopped 30 yards out. A woman climbed down, younger than Clara, with a shawl pulled tight around her, and a child on each hip and the specific hollow look in her eyes that Clara had seen in the letters, in the careful, apologetic handwriting of women who had spent years being told their problems were too small to matter. The woman looked at the barn. Then she looked at Clara. Eleanor Whitmore told me, she said. Her voice cracked on the name. Before she passed, she told me if I ever needed, she told me to come before nightfall, and the barn would be warm. Clara's chest tightened. She looked at Cole. He looked at her. She looked at the woman standing 30 yards away in the Montana cold, with 2 children on her hips and nowhere else to go. She thought about the letter her mother had written, the one she'd read underground in the warmth of a spring-fed stone room built in 10 years of secret Sundays. She thought about every word of it. Then she walked out to meet the woman on the track. Come inside, Clara said. It's warm. The woman's name was Annie Carr. She said it like an apology, soft, quick, the way people say their names when they've spent enough time being told their name is the least important thing about them. She had 2 girls, ages 4, and 2 both dark-eyed and quiet, in the particular way of children who have learned that quiet is safer. Her husband had a temper and a deed to their property, and a friendship with Aldous Greer's land office that had made every legal avenue Annie tried close like a fist. Clara showed her the underground shelter without hesitation. She watched Annie's face at the bottom of the ladder, The way her eyes moved across the shelving, the spring, the stacked quilts, and recognized the expression. It was the same one Clara had worn herself standing in that same spot 2 days ago. The expression of someone who has been cold and frightened for so long that warmth feels like a language they forgot they knew. "How long can we stay?" Annie asked. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. "As long as you need," Clara said. "I don't want to be trouble." "You're not trouble." Clara took one of Annie's girls from her hip without asking the younger one, who was tired and listing sideways, and held her the way she held James, naturally, without ceremony. "You're the reason this place was built." Annie looked at her. Something in her face broke open quietly, the way ice cracks on a river. Not all at once, but along a line that had been under pressure for a long time. "Your mother was a good woman," she said. "She was a complicated woman," Clara said. "But yes, she was good." Cole spent the next 3 days on the roof. He worked from first light until he couldn't see his hands, and Clara could hear him up there. The careful rhythm of it. Methodical, nothing wasted, while she organized the shelter below and got Annie's girls eating properly, and wrote down everything her mother had documented in the cedar box in a second copy she kept inside her coat at all times. She didn't tell Cole why she was making a copy. He didn't ask. That was the thing about Cole Turner that she was beginning to understand. He watched everything and spoke carefully, and never asked for information he thought you weren't ready to give. On the second night, sitting by the fire after the children were asleep, he asked her what she planned to do with the letters. "Send them," she said, "to the Federal Land Office in Helena. There's an agent there. My mother wrote to him twice. He wrote back both times. He knew something was wrong in this county, and he didn't have the evidence to prove it. Now you do." "Now I do." Cole looked at the fire for a moment. "Greer has friends on the territorial postal route." "I know. I'm not sending them through the post." She looked at him. "I was thinking I'd need someone who travels north." He met her eyes. "I can be in Helena by Friday." "That's a hard ride in this weather." "I've made harder." He was quiet for a beat. "Clara, when Greer finds out those letters are gone from this county, and he will find out because men like him always have someone watching, he's going to move fast. You understand that?" "I understand it." "He's going to come here. I'm counting on it," she said. "By the time he does, I want those letters in federal hands." Cole looked at her for a long moment with that steady, dark gaze that never seemed to be calculating anything except the honest truth of what he was looking at. Then he nodded once slowly, like a man who has just made a decision about something larger than the specific thing being discussed. "I'll leave at dawn," he said. He left at dawn, and by noon of that same day, 2 more women arrived on the north track. Clara heard the wagon before she saw it. She came to the barn entrance and found a gray-haired woman climbing down with the careful deliberateness of someone whose body hurt, but who wasn't going to let it show. And behind her in the wagon bed, a young woman barely 20 with a bruise along her jaw that she'd made no effort to cover. The gray-haired woman looked at Clara straight. "Eleanor Whitmore told my neighbor. My neighbor told her daughter. Her daughter is the one in the wagon." She paused. "We didn't know if it was still. We didn't know if anyone was still here." "It's still here," Clara said. "Come inside." By the end of that week, the shelter had 7 people in it, besides Clara and her children. Annie Carr and her 2 girls, the gray-haired woman whose name was Dora Hutchins, and Dora's neighbor's daughter, whose name was Pearl, and 2 sisters named Bess and Luann, who arrived on foot after dark on Thursday night, with nothing but what they were wearing, and a story Clara didn't ask for, because they'd tell it when they were ready. The barn above was filling with evidence of life that anyone riding up the north track could read. She couldn't hide it all. She did what she could. Cole came back on Saturday. He rode in fast and came through the barn gap at a pace that told her before he said a word that something had changed. "The federal agent is on his way," he said, dismounting. "He wants to be here before the evidence moves again." He pulled off his gloves and looked at her directly. "Greer knows." Clara's stomach dropped. "How?" "Someone at the postal route told someone at the land office that a rider came through asking about the Whitmore parcel north of the county line. It got back to Greer by Thursday. He paused. He filed an emergency deed claim Friday morning. Says there's an unpaid tax lien on the north parcel going back 11 years. There's no lien. He made one. Cole held her gaze. He's bringing men up here, Clara. I don't know when, but it'll be before the federal agent arrives. He wants the property empty and any records gone before there's anyone official watching. The cold that moved through her was not the Montana kind. She thought about the cedar box, the copies she'd sent with Cole to Helena, the women downstairs. How many men? She said. I don't know. He'll bring enough. He hesitated. He's also bringing Reverend Marsh. What does Marsh have to do with it? Marsh does the talking, makes it sound like Christian charity taking in a poor widow's land for the good of the county, ensuring proper management. His voice went flat and disgusted on the words. He did it to the Henderson widow in '84, the Pollard woman in '86. It's a practiced routine. Clara turned and walked to the cedar box and stood with her hands on it. 7 women downstairs. 2 of her own children. 1 draft horse and a wagon and a rifle she knew how to shoot, and a man who'd gone to Helena and come back and was standing in her barn telling her that the most powerful men in the county were coming up the track. What do you want to do? Cole asked. She turned around. What I want, she said, is to be ready. The blizzard came the next morning. It came the way bad things sometimes come faster than the signs suggested, more total than anyone expected, the kind of storm that stops being weather and becomes something more like intention. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours. The north track became impassable by midday. The sky turned the color of iron, and the snow came sideways, and the barn shook in gusts that made the new roof sections Cole had repaired moan like something living. Clara got everyone below. She and Cole worked together without wasting words. She moved the children, while he secured Bess and the other horses as best he could, ran rope guides between the barn and what remained of the corral, moved grain and water where animals could reach it. The underground spring kept the shelter warm. The food stores her mother had packed held for 12 people easily. The children slept together in the quilts and generated enough shared warmth that nobody was cold. It was late afternoon when she heard the wagon. 2 wagons, actually. She heard them before Cole did. She'd been listening for it, and she came up the ladder fast and caught his arm. They're here. He went to the barn entrance and looked and came back. 4 men I don't know on horseback. 2 wagons. Greer's in the front wagon. He paused. Marsh is with him. In this storm. He didn't want to wait. Cole's voice was steady, but she could hear what was underneath it. He's worried about the federal agent. He wants this done today. Clara looked at the hatch in the floor. At the ladder. At the children she could hear below, Nora's voice low and storytelling, keeping the younger ones calm the way she'd been doing all day with a gravity beyond her years. She picked up the rifle. Cole looked at it, then at her. I'm not starting anything, she said, but I'm not being taken out of my mother's barn by a man with forged papers while 7 women are hiding in the floor. No, he said quietly. I didn't think you were. Aldous Greer was a tall man, well-fed with the particular confidence of someone who has spent so long having things go his way that he stopped considering the possibility of anything else. He came through the gap in the barn wall without announcing himself, which told Clara everything about how he saw this situation. Reverend Marsh came behind him, smaller, soft-spoken, with kind eyes that Clara recognized immediately as the most dangerous kind. 2 of the 4 armed men came inside. 2 stayed with the wagons. Greer looked at Clara standing in the middle of her barn with a rifle, and his expression rearranged itself from confidence into something that was almost amusement. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, I'm sorry to come out in this weather. This really won't take long. I'm sure it won't, Clara said. Reverend Marsh stepped forward with his hands raised slightly, that practiced gesture of openness of reasonable Christian authority. Clara, dear, we understand you've been through a terrible time, losing your mother, finding yourself in difficult circumstances. The county wants to help. The county wants my land, she said. Marsh smiled the way men smile when they've decided that a woman's directness is actually charming because it means she doesn't understand what's happening. There's a legally documented tax lien. There's a document Greer signed himself on Friday morning, she said. 3 days ago, after a cattle runner came through Helena asking questions. The smile didn't leave Marsh's face, but something behind it went still. Greer's expression did not change. You're confused about how deed law works in this territory. I'm not confused, Clara said. My mother wasn't confused either. She kept very careful records. Your mother is gone, Greer said. Something in his voice dropped half a register. Her records don't mean anything anymore. They mean something to the federal agent riding out of Helena. The stillness that went through both men was the kind that precedes movement, and Clara recognized it and adjusted her grip on the rifle and held their eyes and did not step back. It was Marsh who spoke first. There is no federal agent. Then you have nothing to worry about. She tilted her head. Leave my property. Greer looked at one of the armed men. The look had instruction in it. The man started moving toward the back of the barn, toward the far corner, toward the seam in the floor, and Cole moved to cut him off, and for 3 seconds the barn was an equation with no good solution. Then Nora came up the ladder. She came up fast, the way children do when they've been listening at the top of something and can't stand not seeing anymore. And she was at the top before Clara could stop her. Standing in the barn with her dark hair loose and her serious face taking in the 4 strange men and the rifles, and her mother and Cole and the armed man who'd been moving toward the corner stopped because a child had appeared where he was walking. He looked down at Nora. He looked at the rifle in his hand, and Clara watched something flicker across his face. Calculation and something else, something he hadn't planned on feeling, and he raised the rifle, not pointing it at Nora, but holding it in a way that was a threat completed by implication, a way that said, "Move the child, or I will make you move her." Cole was between them before the thought finished. He simply stepped forward, and to the left, and put his body directly in the path of the implied line, and he did it so cleanly and without drama that it took everyone in the barn a half-second to register what had happened, and by then he was standing between the armed man and Nora, and looking at the armed man with an expression that was not anger, not hot, not explosive, but very quiet and very final. You're going to lower that, Cole said. The man looked at him. He was younger than Cole, heavier, with the edgy look of someone hired for presence rather than judgment. His eyes went to Greer. Greer said nothing. The armed man did not lower the rifle. And Clara, who had been standing in the middle of her barn, thinking about 7 women below her in the floor, and her mother's 10 years of patient, careful work, and Ruth's voice saying, "That's all that's left." Clara stopped surviving quietly. She raised the rifle, not toward the armed man, not toward Cole's standoff. She raised it, and she looked directly at Aldous Greer, who was standing 6 feet from her, and she said, "This land belonged to Eleanor Whitmore. It belongs to me now. Every document in that cedar box has your name on it, and there are enough of them that a federal court doesn't need my testimony to understand what you've done in this county." She let that sit for exactly 1 beat. You rode up here in a blizzard because you're afraid. And you should be. Greer looked at her. For the first time since he'd walked through her door, his expression did something unplanned. Then from behind the wagons outside, through the wall of blowing snow, came the sound of more hooves on the north track. Multiple horses too many for 4 riders, and a voice Clara recognized even muffled through snow and wind and barn wall. Ruth's voice, calling Clara's name. Ruth came through the gap in the barn wall, like the blizzard itself had pushed her coat plastered with snow hair loose from its pins. Franklin 2 steps behind her with the look of a man whose certainty had been rearranged by about 40 miles of Montana winter. Margaret was behind them both, holding her skirts up from the snow with both hands, and behind Margaret came 2 ranch hands Clara didn't recognize, half frozen and not hiding it. Ruth stopped when she saw the rifles. She stopped when she saw Greer. And then she did something Clara had never once seen her older sister do in 29 years of life. She went completely silent. "Ruth," Greer said. He said it the way men say the name of someone they've had financial arrangements with, familiar, slightly proprietary, a reminder of understood obligations. "This doesn't involve you. My sister's land involves me," Ruth said. But her voice had lost something. Clara heard it immediately. The command had gone out of it, replaced by something she couldn't quite name yet. "Your sister's land is subject to a county lien filed on—" "I know what you filed," Ruth said. "Franklin told me Friday night." She looked at Greer for a long moment. Then she looked at Clara. And what moved across her face was something that had been packed down under 30 years of pride and resentment, and was now pushing up through the frozen ground of her expression like the spring that fed the shelter below. "I told him it wasn't right," she said quietly. "I told him not to go along with it." Franklin put a hand on her arm. She pulled away from it. "Then you knew," Clara said. "You knew Greer was coming up here." "I found out Friday. I didn't—" Ruth stopped, started again. "I came out here to warn you. The storm caught us on the road. We lost 6 head of cattle in the drifts between here and the main track, and 2 of my horses are lamed, and I have been riding for 4 hours in a blizzard to get to a barn. I laughed about giving you." Her voice broke on the last 3 words, not dramatically, not with performance, just the quiet fracture of someone who has been holding something at cost for too long. "I'm sorry I laughed." The barn held that sentence for a moment. Greer moved first. He stepped toward Clara with his hand out, not threatening, the gesture of a man who has dealt in transactions long enough that everything looks like a transaction. "Mrs. Whitmore, whatever your family's internal disagreements, the deed matter is separate. The county lien is fraudulent," said a voice from outside. Everyone in the barn turned. The man who came through the gap was not large, and not loud, and not the kind of man who announced himself with drama. He was perhaps 50, wearing a heavy coat with a federal surveyor's badge pinned to the breast, and he had 2 deputies behind him, and the particular calm of someone who has spent many years arriving at places after long difficult rides and finding exactly what he expected to find when he got there. "Thomas Hale," he said to the room in general. "Federal Land Office." "Helena, I received correspondence 6 days ago detailing significant irregularities in Greer County deed transfers going back 11 years. He looked at Aldous Greer with the focused attention of a man who has been looking for a specific thing for a long time and has just found it. "Mr. Greer, I have a federal warrant for your records." The sound Greer made was not quite a word. Reverend Marsh took 1 step backward toward the barn wall, and one of Hale's deputies moved to intercept him without being told. And that small, efficient motion told Clara that Hale had not ridden out here unprepared. "The lien filed Friday is invalid," Hale continued. "It references a property tax account that doesn't exist in territorial records. We verified that this morning before we rode." He looked at Clara. "Are you Clara Whitmore?" "I am. I understand you have documentation. Your mother's correspondence." "I have copies," Clara said. "The originals went north with a cattle runner 6 days ago." Hale nodded once, satisfied. "That's what he told us." He glanced at Cole, who had stepped back from the armed man the moment Hale came through the door, and something passed between the 2 men that suggested they were not strangers. "Good man to send," Hale said. "He is," Clara said. The armed men who'd come with Greer looked at each other with the specific uncertainty of hired muscle who have just watched the situation they were hired for change shape entirely. The younger one, the one who had raised his rifle toward Nora, set it against the barn wall and took 2 deliberate steps back, which was the closest he was going to come to raising his hands. Greer found his voice. "This is an overreach of federal authority in a territorial matter." "Sir," Hale said with the patience of a man who has heard this sentence before, "I have 11 documented cases of fraudulent land seizure, 19 women named in correspondence as victims of coordinated deed manipulation, and a reverend who has been co-signing property transfers to a church account he personally controls." He turned to look at Marsh with the calm, unhurried attention of someone for whom this moment is paperwork and justice in equal measure. "The territorial governor has already been notified. The overreach, as you call it, is the law arriving." Margaret made a sound. Clara looked at her sister and found her standing with both hands pressed over her mouth and tears running down her face with no warning, no build-up the way water runs when a dam gives way. "Mama knew," Margaret said, muffled behind her hands. "She knew all of this. She knew what Greer was doing to those women, and she built—" She looked at the floor, at the seam in the far corner. "She told me once that the north barn had a good foundation. She said it like it meant something more than she couldn't finish." "She told me to go home," Clara said quietly. "The one time I followed her up here as a girl, she said, 'This isn't for you yet.'" She looked at her sister. She was already building it then. Ruth had not moved from where she'd stopped when she came in. She was looking at the far corner, the open hatch, the ladder, the darkness below. And then from the darkness below came a sound, because children don't understand that they're supposed to stay hidden when the barn has gone quiet in a complicated way, and the sound was small feet on iron rungs, and then Nora's face appeared at the top of the hatch, and then Annie Carr's oldest girl, and then Annie herself, and Dora Hutchins, with her hand on the girl Pearl's back as they came up one after another into the barn. 7 people from underground blinking in the barn's dim light, carrying quilts, and the particular dignity of people who have survived something they didn't deserve. Ruth stared. She stared at Annie's daughters, who looked back at her with the steady incuriosity of small children. She stared at Pearl's bruised jaw, which Pearl was not covering anymore. She stared at Dora Hutchins, who was 63 years old, and stood with her chin up, and said nothing, and needed to say nothing. "How many?" Ruth said. Her voice had gone very small. 7, Clara said. "Not counting my children." "And your mother?" 10 years, maybe more." Clara watched her sister's face work through something that didn't have a clean name. "She left me the barn because she knew you'd give it to me if you thought it was worthless. She needed the person who would receive it to be the person who wouldn't sell it, and wouldn't tear it down, and wouldn't think to look at the deed value before they thought about the people." Ruth turned to look at her, full on. Something in her face had cracked all the way through now, not just along the surface. "She didn't trust me." "She didn't trust what you'd do with it if you were afraid," Clara said, not cruelly. "There's a difference." The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind that fills rooms when truth has just been said plainly and everyone in the room is deciding what to do with it. Franklin spoke for the first time since coming through the door. He was a man who understood land and money, and not much else, but he was not a stupid man. "The lien," he said to Hale. "If I provide a written statement regarding what I was told about that filing, and when that would be relevant to your investigation." Hale looked at him with the evaluation of a man measuring the weight of a voluntary offer. "It would," he said. Franklin nodded. Then he looked at Clara. "I'll do it," he said. "Just that." Clara looked at him. She'd never liked Franklin, had never had reason to, and she didn't start now. But she nodded back because what he was offering was real, and she wasn't in the business of refusing useful things on principle. Hale had his deputies take Greer and Marsh out into the storm. There were horses waiting and a short ride to the nearest town, where county deputies were already expecting them based on the telegrams Hale had sent from Helena. The process was efficient and businesslike, and entirely without the drama it deserved, which was, Clara thought, probably how justice actually worked when it worked at all. The armed men who'd come with Greer dispersed without ceremony. The barn was left with Clara's family and Cole, and 7 women from the shelter, and the howling blizzard pressing at every seam of the newly patched roof. Ruth sat down on the floor. She simply sat down right there in the cold barn, as if her legs had made a decision without consulting the rest of her. Franklin looked at her, and then at Clara, and Clara tilted her head toward the shelter hatch, meaning, "Go down, it's warm," and Franklin helped Ruth to her feet and guided her toward the ladder without either of them saying anything. Margaret stayed. She stayed until everyone else had gone below, and then she looked at Clara, with her eyes still wet, and her hands folded in front of her in the particular posture of someone who has something to say that they've owed for a long time. "I want to help," she said. "With this. With what Mama built." A pause. "I have money in Billings. My husband doesn't have access to it. I was careful about that, even if I wasn't careful about much else." Another pause. Mama told me once that caring without acting is just watching. I've been watching for a long time. Clara looked at her older sister. At the guilt that had been sitting in Margaret's face since the cemetery, that hadn't gone anywhere, that had ridden with her through a blizzard and apparently intended to stay. "There are women in this territory who need what Mama built," Clara said. "Not just this one shelter. More of them. Stocked and safe and connected to each other." She let that sit. "That takes money." "Yes," Margaret said. "It does. And someone with connections in Billings who knows which churches are safe and which ones aren't." Margaret almost smiled. "Almost. I know which ones aren't." "I imagine you do." Clara held out her hand. Margaret took it. Not a handshake, just held it for a moment, the way sisters hold hands when they are reaching back over something broken toward something they should have been all along. Then they went below. The shelter that night held 14 people, Clara's family, Annie and her girls Dora and Pearl, Bess and Luann Ruth and Franklin and Margaret, and the 2 ranch hands who sat in the corner, looking profoundly unsure of what to make of any of this. The spring kept the room warm. The food stores held without strain. The children slept in a pile of quilts that Nora organized with the focused authority of a 6-year-old who has decided that this is her job now. Cole sat near the entrance, not inside the circle of warmth exactly, but not outside it either. The position of a man who is not sure if he belongs somewhere but is not willing to leave it. Clara sat beside him. They didn't speak for a long time. She was tired in the specific way that follows the release of something you've been holding at great cost, and he seemed to understand that without being told and simply stayed beside her while she let the tiredness happen. "She picked well," he said finally. "Mama." He looked across the shelter at the women and children and the improbable collection of people that the last 72 hours had poured into this underground room. "She picked the right daughter." Clara looked at her hands in her lap. "I don't know if I picked it. I just did what needed doing. That's what picking looks like most of the time." He was quiet for a moment. "What you said to Greer, when you raised the rifle." He shook his head slightly. "I've met a handful of people in my life who could look at a man like that and not blink. Your mother was one." "You met her twice." "Twice was enough to know." He turned his head to look at her. "You're built the same. Different shape, but the same foundation." Clara felt something move in her chest. Not the grief ache that had lived there since the cemetery, but something below it, something the grief had been sitting on top of without her knowing. "Cole," she said. "Yeah." "Why did you come back after Helena? You'd done what I asked. You could have kept riding north." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "Because I wanted to see how it came out." A pause. "And because I wanted to see you again." He said it the way he said most things, plain, without decoration, in a voice that made it clear he was not in the habit of saying things he didn't mean. Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she leaned her shoulder against his very slightly, and he didn't move away. Outside, the blizzard kept on. Inside, Ruth Whitmore lay on a borrowed quilt in a room her mother had built in secret over 10 patient years, and stared at the warm stone ceiling, and was quiet for the first time in anyone's memory, in a silence that felt less like absence, and more like the start of something she didn't have words for yet. And Annie Carr's youngest daughter turned in her sleep and put her small hand on Ruth's arm without waking, and Ruth looked at that hand for a long moment, and then very carefully, so as not to wake the child, pulled the quilt up around her. James woke once briefly, and Clara went to him in the dark and fed him and rocked him back to sleep and held him a little longer than she needed to. Listening to the breathing of 11 other people in the warm underground room her mother had built for exactly this kind of night. She thought about the letters. The ones addressed to women with no last names. "Come before nightfall. The barn is warm." Hale had the originals in Helena now. They would go before a federal court. Names would be spoken aloud in official rooms. Men who had counted on the silence of frightened women would find that silence had a limit, and the limit was Eleanor Whitmore keeping careful records for 10 years in a cedar box beneath the floor of a barn everyone thought was empty. Clara pressed her lips to the top of James's head. Her mother had left her nothing. Her mother had left her everything. The storm broke on the third morning. Clara knew it before she climbed the ladder. The quality of silence above had changed, gone from the pressed-down roar of wind against wood to something open and still. And when she came up through the hatch and walked to the gap in the barn wall and looked out, the world was white and enormous and quiet in the way that follows violence, when the thing that was trying to break you has spent itself and pulled back. She stood there for a moment with the cold on her face and breathed. Behind her the shelter was waking. She could hear it, the low voices of women, children shifting in quilts. Someone asking for water. The specific early morning sounds of people who have slept in the same space and survived something together, and are now on the other side of it. Ruth's voice low and uncharacteristically careful, answering one of Annie's girls, who had apparently asked her a question. Franklin making himself useful, which Clara had not anticipated and was not sure what to do with. Cole came up the ladder and stood beside her. "It's done," he said, looking at the sky. "For now," she said. "For now," he agreed. They stood in the cold together for a moment, and that was enough. It had become enough over the last 3 days, the standing beside each other, the economy of it, the way he moved through a room in relation to where she was without making a performance of it. She had stopped pretending not to notice. The first thing that happened after the storm was that Ruth asked to see the letters. Not demanded. Asked. Standing in the barn with her hands at her sides and her voice stripped of the command she usually wore it in the way a person sounds when they have spent 3 days underground with 11 other people and had time to sit with themselves in a way they'd been avoiding for years. Clara brought her the copies she'd kept. Hale had the originals, but she'd been thorough, and Ruth sat on the barn floor and read them. She read for 2 hours. Nobody interrupted her. Annie took her girls outside into the snow, which they received with the uncomplicated joy of small children. Pearl helped Dora with the morning meal. Cole repaired a section of corral fence that the storm had taken down. Franklin improbably helped him, and the 2 men worked in near silence with the focused attention of people who need their hands busy while their minds work. When Ruth finished, she set the letters down. "How many?" she said. Her voice was flat in the way that means something is being held very carefully. "The letters reference 43 women by name or initial," Clara said. "Hale thinks the actual number is higher. Some came through here and left no record because Mama wanted them to have that option." Ruth put both hands on her knees and stared at the floor. "I knew Greer was running the county hard. I knew he had arrangements with Franklin on certain land matters." She stopped. "I didn't want to know the rest." "I know. That's not the same as not knowing." "No," Clara said. "It's not." Ruth looked up at her. "What do you need?" Clara held her sister's gaze. "The deed to the north parcel, clear and clean, filed with the federal office in Helena, and not the county commission. Margaret's already handling part of it, but I need your signature as the eldest Whitmore child to make the transfer uncontestable." She paused. "And I need the south grain silo. Not the cattle or the horses, just the grain." Ruth blinked. "That's all." "I don't need much," Clara said. "I never did." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "You're built just like her," she said. "I spent 30 years being angry about it, and I couldn't even tell you exactly why." She looked at the letters stacked on the barn floor. "She never told me about this place because she knew I'd argue about the risk. She knew I'd want it managed, properly documented, run through official channels. A beat. She knew I would have made it smaller. She knew you would have tried to protect it the way you protect everything," Clara said, "by putting walls around it." "And she built walls," Ruth said. "Just underground ones." "She built walls where nobody would think to look for them," Clara said. "That's different." Ruth picked up the letters and handed them back to Clara. "File the deed," she said. "I'll sign whatever you need." The federal case against Aldous Greer and Reverend Caleb Marsh moved with a speed that surprised everyone who knew how territorial courts usually crawled. Thomas Hale had been building towards something like this for 4 years. Clara understood the letters from Eleanor. Whitmore had been the last piece of a structure he'd been quietly assembling, and with the originals in hand, and Franklin Cobb providing a signed statement about the fraudulent lien and Greer's own records seized from his office in Hardin, the case had the particular momentum of a thing whose time had finally fully arrived. The letter came to Clara in late January. Hale wrote it himself in plain direct language. Greer had entered a federal guilty plea to 11 counts of deed fraud and had agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation into associated parties in exchange for a reduced sentence. Marsh had done the same 3 days after Greer once it became clear that the Reverend's church accounts contained funds from 14 different property transfers, all meticulously documented in Eleanor Whitmore's cedar box. At the bottom of the letter, Hale had added a handwritten line. Your mother was the most important witness in this case. She simply needed 10 years to build her testimony. Clara read it twice. Then she went down the ladder and sat in the warm underground room her mother had built and held the letter and let herself feel the fullness of it, the grief and the pride and the particular ache of things that arrived too late for the person who made them possible. She heard a step on the iron rung behind her. Nora came down the ladder with the self-assurance of a child who has decided this is her room as much as anyone's, and sat beside her mother without invitation, and looked at the letter in Clara's hands. Good news, she asked. Very good, Clara said. Nora thought about this. Is Grandma the reason? Clara looked at her daughter, at the dark hair and the serious face, and the eyes that had been watching and storing and understanding far more than any 6-year-old should be asked to carry. Yes, she said. Grandma is the main reason. Nora nodded satisfied and leaned her head against Clara's arm. I figured, she said. The women who had lost land to Greer's fraud did not all get it back. The law moved in the direction of justice without always arriving at it cleanly, and some of what had been taken had been sold and resold, and was too deeply tangled in subsequent transactions to undo without years of further litigation. But 8 of the 11 documented cases resulted in property restoration. 3 women received financial settlements from Greer's seized assets. And the Reverend's church fund was dissolved by court order, and the money placed in trust for the families whose names appeared in Eleanor Whitmore's letters. It wasn't everything. It was more than any of them had expected to get. Annie Carr was one of the 8. She got her property back in February, a modest homestead east of the county line that she'd been terrified to return to, and Clara understood that, without Annie saying it directly. The property itself wasn't the fear. The man who'd driven her off it still had his freedom. Greer's cooperation covered his own crimes, not the private cruelties of the husbands who'd benefited from the system he'd built. She came to Clara the morning she got the notice from Hale's office and stood in the barn holding the document with both hands. I don't know if I can go back there, she said, even with the paper in my hand. You don't have to go back, Clara said. That's not what the paper means. The paper means the choice is yours. Annie looked at it. I want my girls to grow up somewhere that's theirs. Then make it theirs. Clara held her eyes. You know how now. You know what to look for. You know the difference between a wall that keeps you safe and a wall that keeps you trapped. She paused. Your mama knew. Mine knew. Now you know. That's how it moves forward. Annie folded the document carefully and put it in her coat. She left the next morning with her girls in the wagon and didn't look back at the barn because looking back was not the direction she needed to go, and Clara understood that completely. Margaret came through in early March with a banker from Billings. A different banker, a woman named Harriet Voss, who had a reputation in the territory for financing things other banks wouldn't touch, and the 3 of them sat around the underground spring for 2 hours and talked about what Eleanor Whitmore had built and what it would take to build 3 more of them. Not underground necessarily, Clara said. That was specific to the situation here. What it needs to be is hidden in plain sight, something people see every day and don't look twice at. A boarding house, Harriet Voss said. She said it like she'd been thinking about it for longer than this conversation. 3 of them, Billings, Helena, and 1 further south. With a system for letting women know they exist, Clara said. The way Mama did it. Through the right people, in the right churches. Through doctors who ask the right questions. She paused. Through women who've already come through and know it's real. Margaret looked at her younger sister across the warm underground room and had the expression of someone watching a river understand its own current. She always said you were the one, Margaret said quietly. She told me I'd get the worst of the inheritance. She told me, Margaret said, that you were the only one of us who would know what to do with the best of it. The deed to the north parcel was filed with the federal office in Helena on the 14th of March and came back clean and clear and uncontestable on the 1st of April, registered under the name Eleanor Clara Whitmore, in recognition of both women, which had been Ruth's suggestion and which Clara had accepted without argument, because some gestures are not small. Cole was there when the notice arrived. He'd been there since November, which they had stopped pretending was a temporary arrangement sometime around December, when it became clear that the man had no interest in leaving and the barn had room and nobody was asking him to go. He'd rebuilt the roof properly, sealed the windows, repaired the corral, fixed the well, which turned out not to be dry, just silted, and which ran clear after 2 days of work, and now provided good water year-round in addition to the underground spring. He fixed things. Not just structural things. He fixed the way mornings felt in the barn, the steadiness of him, the unhurried competence, the way he spoke to Nora, like she was worth taking seriously, and held James like a man who has decided a child matters without needing to make a declaration about it. Clara watched all of it and said nothing for a long time. It was an evening in April, mild for Montana, with the last of the snow gone from the south-facing slopes and the first mud of spring softening the ground around the barn, when Cole found her outside, standing at the corral fence, looking at nothing in particular. He came and stood beside her. "I've been meaning to say something," he said. "I know," she said. "You know what I'm going to say." "I know what you've been not saying for 4 months," she said. "I've been not saying the same thing." He turned to look at her. "Then say it." She looked at the ground for a moment, at the mud of April, at the place where Nora had planted 3 rows of seeds that morning with the focused determination of a child who has been told she can grow things and has decided to take that seriously. At her own boots, worn at the toes, needing replacement. "I spent a long time believing that surviving was the best I could reasonably ask for," she said. "My husband leaving, coming back to Mama. Watching my sisters take everything and being handed a broken barn in winter." She paused. "I got good at surviving. I got so good at it that I stopped noticing when things had changed, when it wasn't just surviving anymore." "And now," Cole said. She looked up at him, at the dark, steady eyes that had never once looked at her the way men looked at problems, or at property, or at things they were calculating the value of. "Now I think I want more than surviving," she said. "I think I've been wanting it since about the 3rd day of November, and have been too scared to admit it." "You're not scared of much," he said. "I'm scared of the things that matter." She held his gaze. "That's how you know they matter." He reached out and took her hand. Not the way you take someone's hand to lead them somewhere, but the way you take it when you're staying, when the hand itself is the destination. And she let him, which was the harder part, the part she'd been working toward without knowing it, through all the surviving and the letters and the cedar box and the underground spring. She let herself be held. The spring moved into summer the way good things move gradually and then completely. And one morning Clara looked up from where she was working, and the north pasture was green, and the corral held 6 horses, and the garden Nora had planted was 2 feet high, and James was pulling himself to standing against the fence post with the single-minded determination of a child who has decided that walking is a problem he intends to solve. The letters started in May, not the kind her mother had sent, and received. Those networks were established. Now, were running through Harriet Voss's boarding houses, and the church connections Margaret had built in Billings, and the doctor in Helena, who had been quietly waiting for exactly this kind of infrastructure for years. These letters were different. They came from further away: Wyoming, Colorado. Even one from as far as Ohio forwarded through 3 hands before it reached the North Parcel. Women who had heard the stories, not always accurately, not always with the details right, but with the essential shape of it intact. There was a woman in Montana who had opened her barn door, and the barn had turned out to be something more than a barn, and the women who came through it had found their way back to solid ground. Clara read every letter. She answered every one. Some she could direct to Harriet Voss, or to one of the other shelters that had come up in the 6 months since the trial. Some she had to write back to with the honest truth that she didn't have an answer yet, but she was working on it. And some the ones from women who were simply asking if it was real, if the story was true, if there was actually a place where someone would open the door without asking for an explanation. Those she answered in the same way every time. She kept her mother's words and added her own to them. Come before nightfall. The barn is warm. You do not owe anyone the story of how you got here. You owe it only to yourself to arrive. Your children are safe. You are safe. We will figure out the rest together. It was Nora who named it. She said it one evening without preamble. The way children produce exactly the right word for things that adults have been circling came to the barn door and looked at the lantern Cole had hung inside and said, "It's the open barn, isn't it, Mama? That's what it is." Clara looked at her. Because Grandma always left it open, Nora said, even when nobody could see it from the road, even when it looked locked. She tilted her head. It was always open, just from inside. Clara crouched down to her daughter's eye level. She looked at the dark hair and the serious face and the eyes that had watched Ruth Whitmore at the cemetery, and stored it that had heard Cole Turner in the barn, and measured him honestly that had looked at a collapsed north barn in November and said, "It's big," and meant it as enough. "Yes," Clara said, "that's what it is." Nora nodded, satisfied with that, the way she was satisfied with most things once they were correctly named, and went back to whatever she'd been doing. On quiet evenings, when the Montana light went long and gold across the north pasture, Clara sometimes stood on the barn threshold and looked at the lantern glow coming up through the floorboards, warm as the spring below, steady as the stone her mother had fitted without mortar on 10 years of patient Sundays. Cole would come and stand beside her. James would be asleep in the shelter below, small and solid, and growing into the bones his father had given him, and the stubbornness his mother had earned. Nora would be somewhere nearby, organizing something, naming something, deciding something in the calm, decisive way she'd been doing since she was 6 years old, in a cemetery watching her aunts divide a life that was not theirs to divide. The letters kept coming. The door stayed open, and Eleanor Whitmore's youngest daughter, the quiet one, the one nobody expected to survive the winter, the one who received a broken barn and a dry well and 20 acres of frozen rock and turned it into the one thing no court could seize and no fraud could dissolve and no storm could take down, stood in the light of her mother's work in her own hands, and the man beside her who had chosen to stay, and she was not surviving anymore. She was home, and she was never ever leaving.